Welcome to this lecture on aspects of Western philosophy. This is a lecture number 23 and this lecture will focus on the following topics. We will discuss Immanuel Kant's ethical theory with a special focus on concepts like freedom, immortality, which are treated as postulates of morality. But before we discuss these postulates, actually there are more important things to be understood about Kant's philosophy. In continuation with what we have discussed in the previous lecture, where we have analyzed, we have examined the ideas of reason, and we have seen that these ideas of reason are not cognitive, but they are constitutive, and their relevance is more on morality. So that is what we have seen in the previous lecture. For example, these ideas of reasons like self, world and God, and we have seen that pure reason itself cannot prove their reality. Their reality is something which is, if you venture into proving them, then you end up with pointless metaphysics. This is what Kant has demonstrated when he has analyzed Critique of Pure Reason. Now he is actually trying to prove, trying to show that these ideas have relevance in a different realm, and they are extremely important as far as man's moral life is concerned, as far as ethics is concerned. So they are regulative and not constitutive, and they add systematic unity and coherence to our experience. This is what Kant would say, and also have practical importance. So they have practical importance. So in that sense, you know, they are related to morals in significant ways. So this is what we would be addressing in this lecture. So before we get into the central issues of this lecture, we will have an overview of Kant's moral philosophy. So Kant's moral philosophy is famous for its emphasis on deontological aspects of morality, that is, it emphasizes on duty. So it is a deontological moral theory, and the rightness or wrongness of action does not depend on their consequences. So it is against consequentialism. Any approach to morality which stresses on consequentialism or consequences of an action in order to determine its moral worth is blatantly rejected by Immanuel Kant. So in that sense, for instance, he would reject utilitarianism, or he would reject hedonism, which says that a particular action is morally right if it leads to happiness or pleasure. What Kant says is that the moral worth of an action, or whether an action is ethically right or not, that does not depend on the consequences, or that is unconditional. So this unconditionality is a very important aspect emphasized by Immanuel Kant in his ethical theory. An action is right, he says, if it is performed on the basis of our duty. So why duty? Why an action is right? Because it is my duty. Why duty? Duty for duty's sake. So action should be performed for the sake of duty. This is what Kant would argue for. The supreme principle of morality, according to him, is a categorical imperative, which I will explain slightly later, and this determines our moral duty. So there is something called an imperative which is categorical according to Kant, and in order to explain what he means by this categorical imperative, what Kant does is he makes a detailed analysis of the various types of imperatives and distinguishes the categorical imperative from other types of imperatives, like for example hypothetical imperative or assertorial imperatives. A categorical imperative is an unconditional command. So why? There is no question of why, it is my duty. Why should I follow duty? There is an answer given by Kant. It is a very interesting answer Kant gives. What Kant says is that one has to follow one's duty because that is the only and that is the most rational alternative available for man. For rational creatures, following the duty is the rational alternative. So that is the reason why duty is important. So since human beings are rational creatures, it is very important for them to perform actions for the sake of duty, that is to follow reason. And this is different from other two types of normative laws like hypothetical and assertorial. And now for Kant, before we actually start discussing about morality, we should see the possibility of morality, what ensures morality's possibility. and Kant says that nature is impersonal or non-moral. We cannot attribute, we cannot derive anything from that, because nature as such it is given to us is non-moral and impersonal, and it exhibits an order which suggests the possibility of a great and benevolent designer, a god, because nature exhibits a magnificent order, everything is well ordered in nature, and there are certain principles which we sort of learn from. This is something which you have already seen in the previous lecture, and it suggests a grand designer behind it, God. But the problem is that, again we have seen this in the previous lecture, no knowledge about this God or this grand designer is possible as far as human beings are concerned. Its impossibility of metaphysics as a science has been conclusively asserted by Kant when he dealt with the critique of pure reason. Now attempts to establish morality on the basis of such metaphysical truths are ridiculed by Kant. Kant rather tells us that morality is very important, and we need to show that morality is possible, or it is important to prove that it is possible. We can do that in a different way. We cannot expect our metaphysical theories to supplement our moral assumptions. How the world functions is non-moral. Look for the realm of morals outside the realm of nature. So one has to actually look into a different domain to really sanctify our moral assumptions. Morals must be independent of how the world functions. There should be an element of unconditionality about morals. This is what is so central to any deontological approach to morality, because any deontological approach would assert that morality or moral law or moral principle, whatever principle we employ, should be unconditional. It should not be depending on various circumstances or conditions or results or consequences. There should be an element of unconditionality about morals, and it should be universal and rational. It cannot be, there cannot be my morality and your morality. There cannot be moralities, different moralities for different individuals or different types of people or groups of people. What we today understand as individualism or subjectivism in morals or even cultural relativism is not acceptable for Kant. Kant would stress on the universal features of morality. It should be universal because it is rational, and rationality is universally present. It is something which makes man what man is, and there cannot be different rationalities. Rationality is universal. Since that is universal, moral law also should be unconditionally universal. This is a quote from MacIntyre about Kant. When he writes about Kant, what MacIntyre says is, Kant stands at one of the great dividing points in the history of ethics. For perhaps the majority of later philosophical writers, including many who are self-consciously anti-Kantian, ethics is defined as a subject in Kantian terms. For many who have never heard of philosophy, let alone of Kant, morality is roughly what Kant said it was. So very interesting observation. Those who are consciously anti-Kantian have to follow, they followed somehow the Kantian lines, and those who have not even heard about morality or heard about Kant are roughly what Kant said morality is. So Kant's ethics in that sense is very interesting, very exciting domain to study. The idea of necessary, universal, a priori moral knowledge about human behavior, this is what Kant's ethics all about. I repeat, necessary, universal, a priori moral knowledge. And when the emphasis is on a priori elements or a priori aspects, what happens? A priori knowledge does not depend on men's actual behavior. So how human beings actually behave, that does not matter, that is irrelevant for Kant. Kant is, as we have seen when it dealt with the problem of pure reason knowledge in natural sciences, there again he was referring to the conditions, the preconditions of all human knowledge. Similarly here also the stress is on the preconditions. So it is not, he is not bothered about, or he is not interested in how human beings actually do behave, he is rather looking for an a priori knowledge. not knowledge of what is, of how men actually behave, what ought to be. That is the stress. There is a stress on ought, not on is, how men ought to behave. So here Kant has a very definite answer: men or human beings ought to behave for the sake of duty. That is Kant's moral law. Examines the origin of the a priori elements in our moral knowledge, and Kant envisages to discover what the a priori principles according to which we judge when we make moral judgments. So to the a priori principles based on which we make our moral judgments, what are those a priori principles? They are rooted in reason, and Kant says that they are rooted in practical reason. There is a distinction Kant makes between pure reason and practical reason. So that is very fundamental for Kant's ethical theory, that the rational faculty in man is divided into practical and pure. Pure reason we have already seen, which deals with transcendental, aesthetic, analytic and dialectic. Here the practical reason deals with moral law, the unconditional moral law, the a priori elements of that moral law. Again, to isolate the a priori and unchanging elements of morality, to understand what form must a precept have if it is to be regarded or recognized as a moral precept, to know the universal element in moral reasoning, what is unconditionally good, the categorical imperative versus hypothetical and assertorial imperative. So I have been stressing on these aspects, that it should be a priori, it should be the universal, it is a universal element in moral reasoning. When human beings are engaged in moral reasoning, what are the universal elements that determine the process of moral reasoning? This is what Kant would be concentrating on. And here, when you talk about the imperatives, so this figure would identify the major two imperatives, kinds of imperatives. The first one is hypothetical, which is obviously non-moral, which again can be divided into two: problematical, which says that good for a possible purpose, so it is problematical, and assertorial is good for actual purpose. And a categorical imperative is fundamentally moral in nature, and it is apodictic, or it is necessary, good with no reference to any purpose. So this aspect of good is given a lot of importance in Kant's ethical theory. The aspect of good, why do you do good? Good for the sake of doing good, or good with no reference to any other purpose or any circumstances, any conditions, any presuppositions, any goals. I do something, I am performing a very good act, say for example charity, I am giving out a lot of money as charity. For what sake? I am doing it for the sake of publicity. So I am doing it, I am doing good. Definitely giving charity or being charitable is definitely good, but why do I do that? I do that for the sake of getting fame and recognition in society, then it is wrong in Kantian terms. But if I do it for the sake of really doing it, for the sake of believing, because I believe that it is my duty to help my fellow beings, it is fundamental duty of human beings to see that his fellow human beings also prosper along with him. If I do it on the basis of this rational principle, then it is my duty, then it is ethically right. So Kant would emphasize a lot on intentions behind an action. Hypothetical, to elaborate this a little further, it only holds for groups of people who under certain conditions have certain ends in view. I am not going to the details of it because it is very clear. An example would rather makes it very clear. The example for a hypothetical imperative would be this: if I wish to score good marks in the examination, then I should study well. So for good marks I should study well, it is conditional. And assertorial imperative is everybody seeks certain desires, certain ends like happiness. The hypothetical rules for attaining them are universally applicable, yet they are conditional, only hold because of the condition that people seek these ends. So example, rules which are to be observed in order to attain happiness are assertorial laws, and Kant would not accept these type of rules as part of morality. For him, an ethical imperative is not assertorial in nature, it is categorical in nature, it is unconditional, it does not depend on any factors other than its own making. So hedonist on the other hand, as I mentioned, hedonist or utilitarians would affirm that the laws of morality are all assertorial because they lead to some consequences which are desirable, but Kant opposes them, and Kant would assert the importance of categorical imperative. It holds unconditionally and universally. The moral law is the only law of this kind. So once we examine what is this categorical imperative, where can we look for such categorical imperatives which are imperatives unconditionally and universally, then there is only one domain they are available, that is the moral domain, that is the moral law. They are absolute, a priori, rational and based on goodwill. So now Kant is introducing another notion, the notion of goodwill. So now he is going to talk a lot about this concept goodwill, that is rather going to occupy the central, the core of Kantian ethics, the notion of goodwill. There is no ifs and buts as far as categorical imperative are concerned, that is unconditional. Why should I be honest? You have to be honest, that is your moral duty to be honest, because it is ethically, it is rational, and it is, there is no ifs and buts. I cannot say that I will be honest if you are also honest, that is not ethical, that is a kind of hypothetical, or it is a contract. For Kant, ethics or it is based on goodwill, and which has nothing to do with conditions, ifs and buts. They do not depend on any of our purposes or goals, not a teleological outlook. So he denies all of teleological theories of ethics, including that of Aristotle, who advocates a very advanced form of teleological conception. Now let us come to this idea of goodwill, since I mentioned that occupies a central role in Kantian theory of ethics. The question is, what is unconditionally good? Because Kantian moral theory seeks to understand this unconditionally good. There is nothing in the world, this is Kant himself says, I quote, there is nothing in the world or even out of it that can be called good without qualification except a goodwill. So the emphasis is here on the term good without qualifications, good without conditions, universally, unconditionality, all these aspects are emphasized when he introduced the term goodwill. Things which are intrinsically good are good even if they exist all alone, that is why they are unconditional, even if they do not result in, say, what, for example, the happiness of the person concerned who is performing the particular action. Still such actions are good because they are intrinsically good, they are not good for the sake of something else, their goodness depends on themselves, the act itself is good. What motives or intentions make the goodwill good? Duty alone. So that is something which I am going to elaborate slightly later. The aspect of duty can be elaborated by highlighting the importance of reason in Kantian framework. Now again a little further, Kant's idea of goodwill, health, wealth, intellect, these are all things which we desire in our life, and we consider all these things as good, they are all goods to be pursued, or we all desire to attain them, but Kant reminds us that they are all good only insofar as they are used well. So there is a goodwill which is presupposed. If it is, if these things are not, if health is not used well, or if wealth is not used in the proper way, that can be disastrous. So condition of goodness in such cases also ultimately point to the fact that there is a goodwill behind them. All such good things contain goodwill as one element in their makeup, this is what C.D. Broad observes. So they all contain a goodwill as an element in their makeup, and again focus on the agent's will, motives and intentions. As I already mentioned, a lot of stress is on the agent's intentions and motives. The goodwill is always unconditionally good with whatever accompaniments it is found, whatever are the consequences of a particular action. If the action is performed with a goodwill behind it, then that action is bound to be the right kind of action according to Kant. again gifts of fortune, wealth, talents, I have already mentioned all this. Intelligence and worldly wisdom are good only on condition that they are used by a good will. Used by a bad will they result in greater evil. Even happiness is good only when it is the consequences of virtue, and Kant claims that he is only making explicit a truth which is implicitly present in ordinary moral knowledge. So this is why, you know, because of this aspect, as Kant himself acknowledges, is only trying to make explicit a truth which is implicitly present in ordinary moral knowledge. This is so much in tandem with our own moral assumptions, our commonsensical moral assumptions, duty for, and all these aspects are I mean we all take them for granted and we all know them, but Kant is trying to make them explicit. Kant is trying to argue for them, and Kant is trying to tell us why they are important. And a good will is itself an intrinsically good whole. It is good even when it exists quite alone. If with its greatest efforts the good will should yet achieve nothing, Kant says, and there should remain only the good will, then like a jewel it would still shine by its own light as a thing which has its whole value in itself. So Kant's imagery is very peculiar here. He says that the good will shine like a jewel. It does not matter whether it leads to good, I mean desirable consequences or consequences which produces or which leads to happiness and pleasure, does not matter. The consequences consequences do not matter at all. What matters is the good will can stand alone. What makes a good will good? Now that is a very important question to be addressed now. He opposes consequentialism, as it is evident, we have already discussed this. Good will is neither hypothetical nor assertorial. Moral law is categorical, the absolute authority of moral law is underlined. What makes willing right, a good will what it is, a good will good, is that it must be done on a rational principle. So now gradually Kant is trying to elaborate what he means by this. So he has introduced a term goodwill, and now he is trying to say what does he mean by that. There he brings in this notion of rational principle, it must be based on a rational principle, and now Kant is going to formulate his categorical imperative, and in the various formulations, 2 or 3 formulations he gives, and in these formulations he is basically trying to show us that there is a rational element present in it. The moral standard is a law of reason, and man is fundamentally rational. The universe where he finds himself is constructed on rational principles. So it is essential for man to be rational, to be following the rational principles, rational laws. Here in this context we need to elaborate a little bit the aspect of duty, and which actually figures in when Kant discusses the various aspects of practical reason vis-a-vis pure reason. So practical reason is being introduced, the notion of practical reason is introduced in order to account for morality or ethics. Kant would say that a rational action alone is the right action. So even if we perform an action out of say inclination, I am going to discuss it, not because I rationally, it is a rationally thought out action, but it is just I just acted out of inclination, that will not become, or that will not qualify to be called as a good action according to Kant. Very interesting in that sense. For Kant to be good, it should be rational. So to prove that an action is right, we have to prove that it is rational. No contingent factor is relevant in assessing the moral worth of an action. No reference to emotions, circumstances or results are given, which I have already discussed. So it must be universally right, same for every individual irrespective of taste, inclination or circumstances, and it is according to duty. So rational action alone is a right action, and these are the conditions: universality, unconditionality and dutifulness. These are the 3 basic conditions of a good action. An action is in accordance to duty need not necessarily be the morally right action. So there is a difference between action in accordance with duty and action which are done for the sake of duty. So, this is a very important distinction in Kantian philosophy or Kantian ethics. There are actions which are done in accordance with duty, like it's my duty, say for example as a teacher, it's my duty to teach my students well, it's my duty to dedicate a lot of time for their education and their well-being, everything is my and for that I have to work hard and deliver my lectures very well in the class. But say if I am doing it with another intention, I have something else in my mind. See for example, if all the students go and tell others that, oh, this particular person is an excellent teacher, he teaches very well, and this news will reach my director, this news will reach the management of the institute where I am working, and naturally they would also start considering me as a precious jewel in the institute who should be retained in the institute. So, my intention is not the well-being of my students here, my intention is to get promotion or get recognition or gain a lot of fame and recognition from my colleagues and others. That is not a good intention according to Kant, that is not part of my duty. What is part of my duty is to teach well, deliver well in the class and be concerned about the students, or rather the students well-being, but anyway I am doing it because my actions are in accordance with duty. But these actions which are in accordance with duty are performed with a different intention. So, Kant will not consider it as moral or ethical. So, he would say that in order to be ethical, an action should be done for the sake of duty. So, it is not in accordance with duty that matters, but it is done for the sake of duty which matters. Actions in accordance with duty for certain goals and achieving certain ends I have already elaborated, and for the sake of duty, how to perform action, duty for the sake of duty, not based on any consequences, whether I get a recognition or I get a promotion or I gain a lot of fame and people will be talking about me, all these things should not be my considerations when I deliver my duty as a teacher, with the knowledge that it is one's duty, not just because it is one's inclination to do good. See, this is another aspect, some people have a natural inclination to do good, for example charity, and I have a natural inclination to help others and I am just doing it because that is my feeling, I am such kind of a person who is really worried about, it is my inclination to do that. But good inclination or altruism may lead one to do good and to do one's duty. So, to help others is my duty as a human being, but I am doing it, I am helping others not because it is my duty, not because I am aware of the fact that it is my duty, or not because I am doing it for the sake of duty, but it is my inclination just to be good, just to help others is my inclination. But Kant will not accept it, Kant will not consider it as a moral action. Then this springs from inclination and duty versus inclination. So, here comes a struggle between duty which is rational, inclination which is more or less emotional, and it is not based on any rational principle which is universally applicable. And here Kant opposes, or rather Kant is against conceiving or giving any room, any important space for this aspect of inclination. Our physical and psychological nature determines our inclination, we cannot choose our inclination, this is Kant's famous statement, we cannot make, we have no choice, inclinations are with which we are born. So, we can make a choice there, we have to choose between our inclination and our duty. So, we might be having good inclination or bad inclination, the point is that inclination should not be the determining factor in performing actions. What should be the determining factor? Duty, for the sake of duty, rational aspect. So, it must be a rational choice, obedience to law that is universally binding on all rational beings. So, directed towards choice in accordance with the moral law. Sorry. Now, when we come to focus on reason and morality, the important place reason has in determining morality or moral choices, Kant says that no theoretical reason or pure reason which constitutes the object given in intuition, but practical reason. So, here he stresses on the idea of practical reason, it is not pure theoretical reason, it is practical reason. and practical reason is what is present when we are engaged in moral reasoning. So, practical or moral reason is concerned with the production of moral choices or decisions in accordance with the law which proceeds from them, and it is directed towards choice in accordance with moral law, which is universal. Practical reason according to Kant influences our will. What is practical reason? I have already mentioned it here. Practical or moral reason is concerned with the protection of moral choices or decisions in accordance with the law which proceeds from itself. So, practical reason influences the will, it moves the will by means of the moral imperative, it identifies itself with the will and it makes the will a rational power. Practical reason, rational will as the foundation of moral law. So, this is the gist of what Kant talks about the nature of moral will, and he is elaborating its rational nature. He says that it is identified with the will, or it identifies itself with the will, it makes the will a rational power, and a practical reason or rational will as the foundation of moral law. Now, we come to discuss these things: good will, duty and the moral law. So, what is a good will or what is a duty, what is their interrelationship? So, Kant says that a good will is manifested in acting for the sake of duty. So, duty is something which I already mentioned, it is based on a rational principle. Our duties are determined on the basis of reason, and not just acting out of mere inclination or desire, as we have already seen. Duty is the necessity of acting out of reverence for the universal moral law. So, there is a universal moral law and one has to act in reverence for that universal law. You have to respect that universal law and regulate one's actions according to that universal law. So, you are actually, when you are dutiful, you are following the universal law, which is a universal moral law. It is acting in accordance with the universal law which does not admit of exceptions, because universal laws are unconditional, they are applicable for everyone, all times, everywhere, and rational beings alone are capable of acting in accordance with the idea of law. So, this is what makes rational human beings different from other creatures. Many other creatures, they all follow, I mean some of the laws are followed by every one of us. Say natural laws, some of these natural laws we all follow, whether we like it or not, we follow them, but there is a universal rational moral law which human beings alone are capable of following, human beings alone are capable of knowing it and following it. So, that is the kind of law which Kant stresses when he talks about the moral law. How to act for the sake of duty? So, that is the question we have to understand. Here we have to distinguish between a principle and a maxim. So, principles and maxims are different, we will just have a brief look at it. A principle is a fundamental objective moral law, which is the principle on the basis of which we act. They are the regulating forces, rational regulating force behind all our actions, and it is grounded in practical reason. As I have already pointed out, practical reason is that universal rational aspect which makes a particular action our duty, a principle on which all men would act if they were purely rational moral agents. No other considerations, no other circumstances and factors matter here at all. That is the principle on which all of us act so long as we are rational creatures. On the other hand, what is a maxim? A maxim is a subjective principle of volition. On a particular instance, say for example, on a particular occasion I am expected to take a decision, so I make a choice based on a maxim. The question is that whether the choice which I made on the basis of a maxim is in accordance with the universal principle moral law. That is a question, that is how we decide, or that is how we evaluate the moral worth of a particular action, whether a particular act or a particular decision choice is moral or not, is ethical or not, is decided like this. So, subjective principle of volition, a principle on which an agent acts as a matter of fact and which determines his decisions, and may or may not accord with the objective principle of the moral law. So, sometimes it may accord with the objective principle of the moral law, or sometimes it may not. When it accords with, it is morally right, and when it does not accord with, it is morally wrong. When you talk about a moral law, all our actions have moral worth only if they are performed out of reverence for the law. So, this is again not just it is my desire, not just it is my strong inclination to do good, but if I have consciously done this action, if I consciously perform this action in reference for the law, for the universal law. So, Kant makes a very curious condition that an action is morally right only if it is the result of a conscious choice made by the agent. So, the ability of an agent to make conscious choices is presupposed in Kantian scheme of ethics. Just because it follows duty, it is in accordance with duty, will not make a particular action morally right. What makes it right is whether the agent has consciously chosen it in such a way that it follows the duty, the principle of duty, which is the moral law, which is universal and unconditional. So, Kant is a very uncompromising rationalist, idealist thinker in that sense when it comes to morality. Acting out of reverence for law is duty. What is duty? This is probably a kind of explanation given to what duty is. Acting out of reverence for law, for that universal moral law, is duty, and moral law is the form of an imperative, it is a command. The strength of Kantian ethical theory is this: Kant conceives the moral law as a command, as an imperative, as an unconditional command. The practical reason commands, and it is our duty to overcome the desires or any other inclinations which conflict these commands, which are based on choices or which are based on rational choices, which are based on choices which are in accordance with the universal moral law. Now, again we act according to maxims, subjective principles of volition. I have already mentioned this. A good will, when it acts, is motivated by respect or reverence for universal law. This is a repetition actually, because I just want to underline this factor. A good will is motivated by respect for universal law. For the will to be morally good, we should will that our maxims should become universal law. From this point, what follows is Kant's formulation of the categorical imperative. Maxims that cannot become universal laws need to be rejected. So, moral worth of actions are determined by the agent's maxim. The maxim is, as I mentioned, the subjective principles of volition based on which we perform our actual actions. Now, the moral worth of an action depends on the agent's, or it is determined by the agent's maxim. To be morally worthy, a maxim needs to be in accord with the moral law. It must not refer to any objects of sensuous desire. If the actions governed by the maxim obeys the universal moral law, then it will have moral worth. It is then for the sake of duty. So, the distinction which I have mentioned some time back, actions accordance with duty and actions which are for the sake of duty. So, Kant would say that the actions for the sake of duty, such actions exhibit a reverence for the moral universal moral law. Now, the problem is objective principles of morality need not always govern our actions. Discrepancy between the objective principles of morality and man's maxim of subjective principle of volition. We sometimes act on maxims or subjective principles of volition which are incompatible with the objective principles of morality. So, what will happen on such occasions? The will does not necessarily follow the dictate of reason, and in this case, to solve this problem or to find a solution to this problem, Kant provides the formulations of the categorical imperative formulated in 3 different ways. The 3 different ways I am trying to summarize in one slide here. The universal law formulation, which argues that, which says the following: act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So, it is called universal law formulation. The stress is on universal law, that your maxim should be a universal law, which means that should be applicable to you as well. Then again humanity as end in itself formulation, that is the second formulation. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always as an end. So, everything treat others and oneself as an end in itself, not as just a means for another end, not as just as a tool. So, you respect the personality of people including yourself. And the third one is kingdom of ends formulation, which says that all maxims as proceeding from our own hypothetical making of law ought to harmonize with a possible kingdom of ends. So, these are the three formulations. I will just have a very brief explanation of these formulations. The first form of the categorical imperative: act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature, that is another way to formulate it. And the test of the rightness of an action depends on whether we are prepared that everybody else should adopt the rule on which we did the action as his own rule of action. So, if I take money from you and do not return it, now to decide whether this action is right or wrong, I should ask the same question: on what principle did I make this choice, did I act, whether the other person can also adopt that principle. When he takes money from me and refuses to return, is it acceptable for me? If it is not acceptable for me, then I should not perform it, then it is a contradiction. It is a matter of avoiding inconsistencies, because it is a question of following a universal moral law which is unconditional, which is applicable to everyone including yourself. And if you say that you are an exception to that law, then you are actually encountering an inconsistency. It is logically inconsistent to adopt a moral principle for ourselves and to refuse to adopt the same principle for other people. So, as rational beings we need to reject what is logically inconsistent. So, example, it is inconsistent to refuse to repay borrowed money, as the institution of money lending could not go on if everybody refused to pay his debts. So, Kant is again trying to rationalize it, universalize it, and trying to prove that his theory is based on reason. Now, when it comes to humanity as an end in itself, treat every rational being including yourself always as an end and never as a mere means. Never use a rational being as a mere means, as though he had no value in himself except as a means to my subjective end. So, never treat other human beings as a tool, as a mere tool. Respect the individuality of every person. Humanity is an end in itself, and this formulation has three aspects. One is you should treat yourself also as a person. So, suicide for example is when you annihilate yourself, which is also inconsistent, because here what happens is that the person who commits suicide, what he does is one uses oneself, a person, as a mere means to the end. What is the end here? Which is the maintenance of tolerable conditions up to the end of life. So, that is the end. To attain that end, one uses oneself as a means and ends one's life, which is ethically wrong because it is logically and rationally inconsistent. And the man who makes a promise to another one in order to get his things done but does not keep it, make the other person a mere means. Let us now come to what can be termed as the most important aspect of Kantian ethical theory, the postulates of practical reason, because Kant believed that there are three fundamental postulates of ethics, the three fundamental postulates of practical reason, without which morality is impossible. We cannot conceive morality. They are freedom, immortality of the soul and God. So, these three principles, which earlier we have seen that these principles cannot be proved, their existence cannot be proved. The postulates are ideas that transcend the limitations of reason in its theoretical use, though practical use of reason or practical reason cannot really prove the existence of these things like immortality of the soul or God or freedom. We have already seen it. They might take us to antinomies, but they are regulative, are postulates of reason in its practical or moral use. And when it comes to the first postulates, which is probably a very important one or the most important one, we can even say arguably, the idea of freedom is a practical necessity. No theoretical proof for freedom is possible, we have already seen that, and we cannot also say that freedom is not possible. So Kant says we cannot prove, theoretically we cannot prove freedom, but at the same time we cannot provide a proof which for arguing that freedom is not possible. Then the condition of the possibility of a categorical imperative is to be found in the idea of freedom. If there is no freedom, then there is no unconditionally following a law, a moral principle. In order to follow a moral principle, it is presupposed that I can follow it. If I cannot follow it, then it is pointless to say that I should follow it or I ought to follow it. So Kant says that without freedom we cannot act morally for the sake of duty, and ought presupposes a can. First of all, I should be able to follow it, only then someone else can tell me that you ought to follow that. So absolutely freedom is no doubt a most important postulate. Moral obligation presupposes that we have the freedom to obey or disobey the law, and we can make universal laws only if we are free. Practical reason must regard itself as free. Categorical imperative presupposes the idea of freedom and a practical necessity for the moral agent. So without this notion of freedom there is no conception of moral agency possible. The notion of moral agency is possible because we are all moral agents, because we are all free. If we are not free, then we cannot be treated as agents who are capable of making rational choices independent of the influence of other people. If that is impossible, then one cannot tell me that I ought to have done that, or one cannot morally evaluate my actions because I had no choice. I can always say that I have no choice, that was the only choice available. Only when there are choices available, the whole idea of rationally making a choice becomes relevant. And for Kant, this notion of rationally making a choice is associated with the concept of duty. Only a rational duty is one's rational choice. And now when it comes to immortality, which is again a very interesting principle, moral law commands us to pursue virtue. Virtue consists in being in complete accordance of will and feeling with moral law. Moral law which is universal and unconditional, and virtue consists in being in complete accordance with of will and feeling with moral law. This complete accordance of its perfection, this complete accordance of will and feeling with the moral law is possible only for a perfect being, and such a perfection is almost impossible to achieve in one lifespan. So the perfect good must be realized in the form of an indefinite unending progress towards the ideal, and this suggests that this endless progress presupposes the unending duration of the existence of the same rational being. This is immortality of the soul, a postulate of the pure practical reason, not demonstrable by reason in its theoretical use, but to deny immortality is to deny moral law, because then this notion of following virtue cannot be explained. Now the third postulate, which is existence of God, moral law demands that virtue and happiness are necessarily connected a priori, and happiness is a state of a rational being in the world with whom in the totality of his existence everything goes accordance to his wish and will. So this is Kant's definition of happiness, very interesting and very peculiar definition. I repeat, happiness is the state of a rational being in the world with whom in the totality of his existence everything goes accordance to his wish and will, and a harmony of physical nature with man's wish and will. This is what the condition of happiness demands, which is actually the a priori synthetic connection between virtue and happiness. Happiness ought to follow and be proportionate to virtue. For this we must postulate the existence of a cause of the whole nature, and this cause is God, who is distinct from nature. It contains the ground of the connection of happiness with morality. So, God here is being introduced as a logical condition for the a priori synthetic connection between virtue and happiness. Without that you cannot explain this kind of an a priori synthetic connection. Now, God apportions happiness to morality according to the conception of the universal law. Happiness is to be apportioned to morality. So, for that you need a principle, a God, and the omniscient omnipotent God, who is the cause of nature, is conceived as capable of bringing into existence a world in which happiness is exactly proportioned to virtue. So, it is not something which theoretical reason can prove, but something which practical reason necessitates or presuppose. So, we will conclude here with a very brief evaluation of this. When it comes to postulates of morality, as I have already said, all the three proceed from the principles of morality, which is a law, which is a universal unconditional law, and they extend our knowledge from a practical point of view. So, they are postulates of practical reason, they cannot be proved theoretically, pure reason cannot prove them, and there are several problems which this ethical theory of Kant encounters. One of them is that the deontological ethics rejection of the consequentialist approaches, it too formalistic and abstract, it stresses on a priori conditions, difficult to deal with choices made in practical life. So, Kant seems to be telling us that before we make a choice in our day to day practical life, we should think in mind, or we should rationally assess whether this choice we make is in accordance to the universal law or not. So, every human being practically or theoretically needs to know what the universal law is. So, it is too formalistic. I mean, on most occasions in our day to day life we make choices instantly, we may have to make instant choices, and on each occasion if we have supposed to examine whether it is in accordance with the universal moral law, it is a too much of a condition. And another thing is the distinction which Kant makes between duty and inclination. Just because a particular action follows duty will not make it a right action according to Kant. So, two human beings performing their duty, one A, for example, person A performs it because that is his inclination, person B performs his duty because he rationally knows that it is his duty and rationally takes a decision, makes a choice to perform his actions for the sake of duty. So, though both of them have performed their duty, Kant would say that A's action is not ethically right or need not be ethically right, because it has sprung from inclination. On the other hand, B's action is rational, so it is morally right. This kind of a distinction introduces a lot of confusion and dilemmas in our life. Practical reason demands the postulates which cannot be proved. Again, on the one hand, theoretical reason asserts that it is impossible to prove the existence of these postulates, but practical reasons demands that they exist, but does not provide any proof for it. In what sense are they rational? One can raise the question, what do you mean by rationality, what do you mean by practical reason in this sense? They cannot be proved. A person can say that I am quite rational and that is the reason why I am unable to accept the validity of these postulates. So, these are some of the problems which Kant encounters. The most important problem I have already mentioned in the beginning is that with the division of practical reason from pure reason, Kant introduces a fragmentation of human rational faculty, which has severe consequences in philosophy as well as in intellectual culture and civilization. So, Kant himself recognizes this and attempts to provide a solution with the conception of a third critic, the critic of aesthetic judgment, which tries to unite the fragmented rational faculties in man. That is not the part of this lecture. So, we will wind up here now, and the next lecture will be focusing on Hegel's contribution. Thank you.